Just a word of warning after what Frank said in his lecture. Hannah Arendt spoke in the outmoded language of the 1950s, and she always referred to men and man and never to women. So I hope that didn't detract from your enjoyment of the essay. So actually, the essay, What is Freedom, follows on nicely from Kant's What is Enlightenment, because as in all her work, she doesn't try to instruct us, she just wants to encourage us to think for ourselves. So in this essay, one of 8 in the collection Between Past and Future, she gives us this philosophical and historic panorama of the concept of freedom. But because her thinking is so compressed and she jumps back and forth through the ages, it's really quite hard to follow how she arrives at some of her quite startling claims and statements. But what helps us to understand better what she's doing is to be aware of the method that she uses and why. And to do that, we need to place the essay in the context of the preface in Between Past and Future. So in this preface, she says, we live in a peculiar gap or an interval in time where the Western tradition of philosophical and political thought is broken beyond repair. There's nothing authoritative to guide our thinking anymore. Now, she sees the Western tradition as wearing thin, actually since the start of modernity, but it's the experience of 20th century totalitarianism, Nazism, Stalinism, and the experience of the Holocaust that really put the nail in the coffin of the concepts and the categories of thought that we've inherited. But there's nothing nihilistic about those conclusions. Really, it gives us a unique opportunity to re-examine those inherited concepts and trace them back to their origins, understanding how they've changed from their original form, and then to reappraise them. And she does that by using this metaphor of the pearl diver. So the pearl diver goes to the bottom of the sea, where all the ruins of our tradition lies, digs out and breaks off valuable fragments, and then brings them up to the surface. So although they've kind of undergone a sea change over time, they do have value as thought fragments, as something that we can salvage from the debris of our tradition. And so using this method of the pearl diver, she reappraises the concept of freedom, but she actually turns against the idea of freedom that we've inherited from the Western tradition. But then she brings to light a notion of freedom that never made it into the tradition, and that is political freedom. And so why it's important to kind of bear in mind the preface, the start of the preface, is that she brings the notion of freedom as political action to the fore. Now, this freedom is captured by the French poet René Char, and she uses his poetic description of that fleeting moment of political freedom that he experienced during the French resistance. But unlike most of our inherited concepts, that experience of political freedom, it was never given a name, and it kind of just gets, it doesn't get passed on to us consciously, and so it's very easy to be ignored, and that's why she calls it the lost treasure. But, it's not a figment of imagination. I mean, like all Arendt's thinking, it's based on concrete living experiences, in this case, the French resistance. But actually, throughout her work, she always marvels at how examples of political freedom, mostly in times of crisis and revolutions during the modern age, have occasionally but repeatedly arisen. And I think that her idea on political action as freedom is possibly unique, and it's certainly exhilarating. So I'll try to move on and see how she gets there in the essay, which has 4 parts. The first section begins with a startling move. So after she exposes this tangle of contradictions that exist in our political and philosophical tradition on the problem of freedom, and she manages to have a dig at Kant for thinking that the will could have had anything to do with freedom in the first place, she bluntly says that the tradition got it wrong and led philosophy up the garden path. So the Western tradition's big mistake was to take the idea of freedom out of the realm of politics, its original home, and put it where it didn't belong, in the realm of thought. So it's our Western tradition of freedom that begins, according to Arendt, with the notion of freedom as inner freedom, something that goes on within the domain of the will and not as something experienced in the world. And she keeps reiterating that politics, action and freedom are all interconnected. She says, the raison d'etre of politics is freedom and its field of experience is action. So then she turns to Epictetus, the Greek Stoic philosopher, to show how he detached freedom from political action. He transferred the idea of freedom in the world into the inner self, just so that he could exert self-control free of the vagaries of external circumstances over which he had no control. But it was only possible for him to do that because of the prior experience of the Greek polis, where freedom did exist in a politically organised space outside of the private sphere of the household. And if it wasn't for that experience, he would never have even had an inkling about what inner freedom was. So Epictetus, unwilling to live in the contingencies of life, he transferred the tangible world, the tangible worldly relations from the public realm into the inner space of the self. And just to reiterate how wrong Epictetus was about freedom, she says, without a politically guaranteed public realm, freedom lacks the worldly space to make its appearance. And then freedom as a demonstrable fact and politics coincide and are related to each other like two sides of the same matter. So she summarizes our tradition, how it's moved consistently in the direction of separating freedom from politics, whether it's the ancient philosophers who wanted to be free from politics for the sake of the superior life of the mind, or early Christianity for the sake of salvation, or because the 20th century experience of totalitarianism made people skeptical about politics and its compatibility with freedom. And in the 1960s, when she's writing this, because politics seemed to be eclipsed by social and economic questions rather than the political. Then in the second section, she introduces her notion of action and how it relates to political freedom. Now there's three elements to it. First, political freedom has nothing to do with the will, that is free will or freedom of choice. But instead it's to do with action, and action as a beginning. So action initiates something which can bring something new into the world that you couldn't have predicted. And this goes against our usual idea of political action that's normally associated with a fixed goal or an end product, action with a telos. But Arendt says that for action to be free, it cannot have a fixed endpoint. It can't have a predetermined goal. Then second, she says that political freedom can only arise through action only as long as we act. So it only lasts as long as we act. And third, to be free and to act are the same. So her idea of political action is analogous with performing arts, and that's similar to the ancient Greeks. And if we understand politics as action, it does make sense. So the excellence or the virtuosity that lies in the performance itself. It's not the end product. It remains alive only as long as the performance or the action is ongoing. It takes place in public in front of an audience, and it needs a publicly organised space in which to appear. And basically that's the description of the Greek polis. And she goes on to describe the tangible political space that the ancient Greeks created. The realm where freedom is a worldly reality, tangible in words which can be heard, in deeds which can be seen, and in events which are talked about, remembered, and turned into stories before they are finally incorporated into the great storybook of human history. Now, Arendt's not hankering after, nostalgically after the Athenian polis, but she wants to bring to fore, along with the Roman experience of politics, those moments when political action, politics, were placed in a position of dignity. And then she starts the third section by restating the problem of freedom, that the entire tradition from classical antiquity through Christianity to the modern age removed freedom from its home in political experience and transposed it into the inner domain of the self. And then she comes to the ideal of freedom, how the ideal of freedom in our tradition became the ideal of sovereignty, the free will, independent from others. And this is where Arendt thinks the most serious wrong turning that the Western tradition took. And she says, because of the philosophic shift from action to willpower, from freedom as a state of being manifest in action to the liberum arbitrium, the ideal of freedom ceased to be virtuosity in the sense mentioned before and became sovereignty. The ideal of free will, independent from others and eventually prevailing against them. She said that is the philosophic ancestry of our current political notion of freedom. And actually that's Rousseau and his political philosophy on the theory of sovereignty, that he's the main representative. And she sees the idea of freedom as sovereignty as probably the most pernicious consequence of the tradition's notion of freedom as free will. And that's why she makes her blunt claim in her final sentence in this section: if men wish to be free, it is precisely sovereignty they must renounce. Now, that sounds provocative, particularly in the light of Kant and autonomy, the importance of autonomy. But if we take Arendt's approach to political action, I think non-sovereignty shouldn't be a shocking idea. I mean, we live in a plurality, that is, we share the world with many different people, and because of this plurality, we act together with different wills and opinions conflicting and jostling in an interrelationship. So whenever we start something through our action, together with others, you can never be sure how things are going to turn out. You can't be sure of the outcome. And actually, if you try to impose a fixed outcome, then you're just submitting others to your will, and that's nothing to do with action as freedom. So and I think that if understanding that we aren't sovereign, it doesn't paralyze political action. And on the contrary, Arendt implies that whenever freedom as political action has arisen, for example, in all the revolutions of the modern age, it's actually the issue of sovereignty that has contributed to their failure. In the final section, Arendt comes to the notion of freedom that never made it into our tradition, and that something has nothing to do with the will, and it's all to do with doing and acting. And here she goes to the pre-philosophic tradition of classical antiquity. By looking at the verbs to act in ancient Greek and Latin, she finds that they cover a range of meanings that were associated in the Greek case with the polis, to begin, to lead, to rule, to carry something through, and then in the Roman case, associated with the foundation of the city as a guarantor of freedom, to set something in motion, to make something endure. And she says that although the Romans never found a theoretical concept of freedom that reflected their political experiences, it was embedded in their vocabulary. And then, having earlier on criticised Augustine as an anti-political Christian thinker who introduced the notion of freedom as free will into our philosophical tradition, she actually then finds something quite remarkable in his treatise, The City of God. So I'm translating or paraphrasing Augustine, I'm not sure which. Each birth is a new beginning, and with it, something new comes into an already existing world, and this coming into the world is identical with the appearance of freedom in the world. And from this, Arendt draws out that the fact of our being born it's proof of our capacity to begin, and as our capacity to act and to begin something new. So although Augustine can be blamed for breaking the Roman tradition of freedom as an exclusively political concept by making free will synonymous with freedom, because he was at the crossroads between the Roman Empire and Christianity, both a Christian and a Roman, it's actually his experience as the Roman that in some form preserves the concept of freedom as a worldly reality. Now, Arendt ends the essay with something that might sound a bit supernatural, but it does actually reflect quite accurately the contingency of our world. She uses this metaphor of miracle to capture how our capacity to act interrupts the flow of the world's automatic processes and produces something new, something utterly improbable and unexpected, like a miracle. And so with political action, every now and again, in an unforeseeable and unpredictable way, the flow of the world is interrupted, and it gives a chance for freedom to appear as a tangible reality. And sometimes, never in a predictable fashion, it can change the course of history. So, Alistair, you asked me to draw out the relevance for our time in this essay, for our times. And I think Arendt's notion of political action as freedom is exciting, it's thought-provoking, and I hope we can discuss it in the seminar to see whether it still is relevant. But I think the main relevance of this essay is that it can be taken as a lesson on how to think. And Arendt says that thinking needs practice. All the essays in Between Past and Future, they show her exercising or practicing her own thinking, and she calls them exercises in political thinking. It's like, how do we think in this gap between past and future? There's no authoritative tradition to bridge that gap anymore. As she called it, thinking, you need to think without banisters. But I think it's definitely something that we can all go away and grapple with if we want to try and understand the world we live in.